He trusted her with everything: the business, his love, his life. But one day, he started noticing strange things: her late-night outings, hushed phone calls that she ended as soon as he entered the room, and money transfers to unknown accounts. His suspicions grew, and the truth he uncovered shattered his world. Her secret lover? That was just the tip of the iceberg. What was she really hiding? You won't believe how it all ended. Her secret lover was just the tip of the iceberg. You won't believe what she did next. The morning sun filtered through the thick curtains of their spacious living room. Sylvia, the beloved wife, in her flawless dress, handed a cup of freshly brewed coffee to her husband, James. He had adored her since the first moment he saw her. Her smile was always like a promise to him, pure, serene, and eternal. "Wonderfully, as always, when you're by my side," Sylvia replied, touching his shoulder. Their home seemed perfect: pristine white walls, family photographs in frames, and a manicured lawn outside the window. But, like any facade, this picture concealed a dark truth known only to her. At night, Sylvia was no longer the woman James thought he knew. Something changed in her eyes when she stepped outside the house. Her phone suddenly went silent, and instead of her usual perfume, she chose something richer, even daring. On the way to the hotel, her heart pounded as if it wanted to burst out of her chest. She knew it was wrong. She knew she was risking everything she had. Yet, strangely, this very risk gave her a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: freedom. Nick was waiting for her in the room. His presence changed everything. His touch, his gaze. All of it made her forget about the mundane, her responsibilities, and James. "Uriel, I couldn't find it." These meetings were tea. That evening, returning home, Sylvia found a message from James on her phone. "Your lad." Her finger. Yes, everything. Her heart raced harder than ever. She couldn't have known that James had seen her a few hours earlier, sitting in his car in the hotel parking lot. James stood by their bedroom window, watching as Sylvia got into bed, pretending nothing had happened. He suspected, but he didn't have proof. "Is something wrong, dear?" she asked, noticing the tension in his gaze. "No, everything's perfect," he replied, wearing the same smile she had shown him that morning. But their eyes didn't meet. James sat in his study, holding his phone. All he could hear was his pulse, the dull thud of blood mixed with the feeling that his marriage was crumbling. Had what he saw in the hotel parking lot truly been betrayal? Or was it just a coincidence? His mind desperately searched for an explanation that could justify Sylvia's actions. But every time he recalled her expression when she came home, that cold fear only grew. "I need to know the truth," he muttered, pressing the call button. The voice on the other end was low and professional. A detective named Mark Davis had a reputation for never failing a case. "Mr. Wilson," Mark greeted. "Can you explain what exactly you need me to find?" James took a deep breath and began. "My wife, Sylvia. Lately, I've noticed strange things. Delays. Calls she ends as soon as I walk into the room. And yesterday, I saw her near a hotel. She wasn't alone." "You want me to gather evidence?" Mark clarified. "Yes," James replied. "I need the truth, no matter how painful it is." The next few days passed for James in anxious anticipation. He tried to act as if nothing had happened, but every glance at Sylvia felt like a struggle. She remained perfect, too perfect. Her touches, her smile, even her voice. All of it seemed artificial, as if she were playing a role. One day, as Sylvia was getting ready to leave for lunch with a friend, James watched her from the kitchen table. "Don't be late coming back," he said, trying to sound casual. "Of course, darling," she replied and blew him a light kiss in the air. Her face remained impassive, but James already knew. Mark was following her. Mark called late in the evening. "I have something for you," he said. His tone was restrained but heavy. James hurried to the detective's office, his heart pounding as if he were heading to an execution. Mark laid out several photographs in front of him. The first showed Sylvia entering an upscale restaurant. The second captured her with a man holding her hand. Finally, the third depicted them leaving the restaurant together and getting into his car. "That's Nick Patterson," Mark said. "He has a decent reputation." wealthy, single. And it seems he has a special interest in your wife. James stared silently at the photographs. Something inside him broke. He felt as though his world had shattered into tiny fragments. "Are you sure?" he whispered, even though he already knew the answer. "Yes," Mark replied succinctly. "But that's not all." Mark placed a flash drive on the table. "There's also video footage. It was taken last night while she was with him. It's up to you whether you want to see it." James took the flash drive but didn't even say thank you. He walked to his car, feeling as though the ground was slipping from beneath his feet. At home, he locked himself in his study, inserted the flash drive into his laptop, and played the video. The footage showed Sylvia and Nick in a hotel room. Their movements, their smiles, their kisses. It was all too real to deny. In his pain, he almost smashed the screen. The thought exploded in his mind. How could she? James heard footsteps outside the door. He quickly closed the laptop. "Darling, are you home?" her soft, melodic voice called out. He composed himself, put on his mask of indifference, and stepped out to meet her. "How was your day?" he asked, watching her reaction. "Wonderful as always," she replied with a smile. But this time, he saw her smile differently. That night, James lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He already knew what he needed to do. But now, everything depended on Sylvia's next move. James stood in a dark corner of the parking lot, his heart pounding so loudly it felt as though it could be heard even from a distance. He stared at his phone screen, tracking the signal indicating Sylvia's location. Her phone, which he had secretly been tracking through an installed app, showed that she was at the Armour Hotel. This was the same place where she had been spotted earlier. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine her face, her excuses if she discovered what he knew. But this time, he no longer wanted words. He needed the truth, only the truth. Earlier that day, James had arranged a meeting with Mark. They discussed the plan. "If you want to catch her in the act, we need the perfect setup," the detective said. "I want her to look me in the eye when her lies crumble." Mark suggested setting up cameras in the room where they would meet. That way, James wouldn't just learn the truth. He would have undeniable proof. "It's risky," Mark cautioned. "If she suspects anything, the whole thing could fall apart." "She suspects nothing," James assured him. "She has no reason to think I know." Later, as Sylvia was getting ready to leave the house, James watched her every move. "You're meeting Mary again today?" he asked, feigning indifference. "Yes, we're planning a walk," she replied with a smile. Her smile was flawless. But now, James saw something else in it, a mask she used to hide behind. "Have a good time," he said with a nod. Sylvia left, and James immediately took out his phone to check her location. As expected, she was heading to the hotel. He arrived at the hotel a few minutes later, parking his car 2 blocks away. Mark was already on site, checking the equipment. "Everything is set," the detective said, pointing to a tablet screen displaying a live feed of the room. James watched the screen intently as Sylvia entered the room. She looked calm, even happy. A few minutes later, Nick entered, holding a bottle of wine. "How are you?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "Better when you're here," she replied, letting him kiss her. These words resonated in James' mind like the toll of a bell. He could no longer hold back. James burst into the room, throwing the door wide open. Sylvia and Nick froze in place. Her eyes widened in shock, while a shadow of fear flickered across Nick's face. "What's going on here?" His voice was loud but cold. Sylvia quickly stood up, her face pale. "James, it's not what you think," she began, trembling. "Not what I think." He glanced at Nick. "Who is he, then? Just a friend?" Nick stepped forward, trying to say something, but James didn't give him the chance. "Shut up," he shouted. "I want to hear it from her." Sylvia closed her eyes as if searching for the strength to speak. I can explain everything," she whispered. "Explain?" James laughed. "Everything I need is already on video." He pulled out his phone, played the recording, and tossed it onto the table. Sylvia stared at the screen, disbelief flooding her expression. "James, please. You destroyed our marriage. You destroyed everything I believed in," he said, his voice quieter now but filled with pain. Mark watched the scene unfold from the hallway. His instincts told him this drama wasn't over yet, and he was right. Sylvia suddenly changed her tone. And you? Do you think you're perfect? Do you think I wanted this? You were always busy with work, never noticing me. And that's your excuse? James retorted angrily. I wasn't looking for this, she yelled. But you pushed me away. Their voices echoed through the hallway, drawing attention. Nick stood silently aside, watching as everything fell apart. When the shouting subsided, James simply walked out. He left her there, with Nick and the shattered truth. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. James sat at the kitchen table, his gaze sweeping over the empty room that had once been a symbol of their happy life. The empty coffee cup in front of him felt like a cruel reflection of his heart, empty and cold. The divorce papers lay beside his phone, signed and ready to be filed. Yet something held him back. He thought about her eyes in that moment when he exposed her with Nick. There wasn't just guilt or fear in them. There was something more. Something she hadn't said. The kitchen door opened, and Sylvia appeared on the threshold. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "James," she began softly, sitting across from him. "What?" His voice was cold, distant. "We need to talk," she said, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. "We've already said everything we could," he cut her off, not even looking at her. "No, you have to hear me out." Her voice trembled. "It's not what you think." James glanced at her. "Not what I think. I saw everything with my own eyes, Sylvia. Even if you try to convince me it was a mistake, the truth won't change." "I know," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "But it's not just about Nick." That stopped him. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning closer. "There's something you don't know?" She looked him straight in the eye. "And I'm not sure you're ready to hear it." These words left him in a constant state of anxiety for the next few days. She said nothing more. Her silence was calculated. It made him doubt, searching for answers he might not even want. One evening, coming home, James overheard her phone call. She was speaking quietly, but her words caught his attention. "No, I can't right now. He suspects everything." "Yes, I know, but it's dangerous." He stood in the doorway, watching as she ended the call. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, trying to conceal his anger. "That was Mary," she replied quickly. "Mary? Your best friend, whom I haven't seen in months?" He raised an eyebrow. Sylvia didn't answer. "Enough with the lies, Sylvia. What are you hiding?" "Nothing," she said, averting her eyes. "If it's nothing, why are you afraid of me finding out the truth?" James decided to reach out to Mark again. He needed answers. "She's hiding something, and it's not just an affair," he told the detective. "Do you want me to continue the surveillance?" Mark asked. "Yes," James replied. "Find out who she really is." A week later, Mark returned with new information. "You were right, James. This is much more complicated than it seems." He placed photos and documents in front of him. Among them were records of large sums of money being transferred from Sylvia's accounts to unknown accounts over the past several months. "She's sending money to someone, but I don't know who yet," Mark said. "And it's significant amounts." James stared at the documents in astonishment. "Where is she getting this kind of money?" he asked. "Do you have any ideas?" Mark looked at him pointedly. That night, James walked into their bedroom, where Sylvia was sitting with a book in her hands. "Tell me the truth, Sylvia," he said, standing in the doorway. "About what?" she asked, trying to appear calm. He tossed the documents onto the bed. "What is this?" he asked, looking her directly in the eyes. Sylvia froze. "I can explain," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, this time you're just going to tell the truth. Who are these people? Why are you sending them money?" She lowered her head. "It's not what you think." She started. "Then what is it?" His voice grew sharp. It's blackmail," she admitted, barely holding back tears. "Blackmail?" James couldn't believe it. "By who? Why?" Sylvia took a deep breath. "Nick isn't just my lover. He's manipulating me. He has something that could destroy not only me but you too, James." This stopped him. "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him with eyes full of fear. It's not time for you to know yet, she whispered. Rain streamed down the windows of their house, creating the illusion of tears, wrapping the home in sorrow. Sylvia stood by the suitcase she had packed for the third time in the past 2 days. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded so loudly it seemed even the neighbors might hear. She couldn't stay here. James was asking too many questions. He knew more than he should. And while she wasn't sure how close he was to the truth, she couldn't wait any longer. These words left him in a constant state of anxiety for the next few days. She said nothing more. Her silence was calculated. It made him doubt, searching for answers he might not even want. One evening, coming home, James overheard her phone call. She was speaking quietly, but her words caught his attention. "No, I can't right now. He suspects everything." "Yes, I know, but it's dangerous." He stood in the doorway, watching as she ended the call. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, trying to conceal his anger. "That was Mary," she replied quickly. "Mary? Your best friend, whom I haven't seen in months?" He raised an eyebrow. Sylvia didn't answer. "Enough with the lies, Sylvia. What are you hiding?" "Nothing," she said, averting her eyes. "If it's nothing, why are you afraid of me finding out the truth?" James decided to reach out to Mark again. He needed answers. "She's hiding something, and it's not just an affair," he told the detective. "Do you want me to continue the surveillance?" Mark asked. "Yes," James replied. "Find out who she really is." A week later, Mark returned with new information. "You were right, James. This is much more complicated than it seems." He placed photos and documents in front of him. Among them were records of large sums of money being transferred from Sylvia's accounts to unknown accounts over the past several months. "She's sending money to someone, but I don't know who yet," Mark said. "And it's significant amounts." James stared at the documents in astonishment. "Where is she getting this kind of money?" he asked. "Do you have any ideas?" Mark looked at him pointedly. That night, James walked into their bedroom, where Sylvia was sitting with a book in her hands. "Tell me the truth, Sylvia," he said, standing in the doorway. "About what?" she asked, trying to appear calm. He tossed the documents onto the bed. "What is this?" he asked, looking her directly in the eyes. Sylvia froze. "I can explain," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, this time you're just going to tell the truth. Who are these people? Why are you sending them money?" She lowered her head. "It's not what you think." She started. "Then what is it?" His voice grew sharp. It's blackmail," she admitted, barely holding back tears. "Blackmail?" James couldn't believe it. "By who? Why?" Sylvia took a deep breath. "Nick isn't just my lover. He's manipulating me. He has something that could destroy not only me but you too, James." This stopped him. "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him with eyes full of fear. "It's not time for you to know yet," she whispered. Rain streamed down the windows of their house, creating the illusion of tears, wrapping the home in sorrow. Sylvia stood by the suitcase she had packed for the third time in the past 2 days. Her hands trembled, and her heart pounded so loudly it seemed even the neighbors might hear. She couldn't stay here. James was asking too many questions. He knew more than he should. And while she wasn't sure how close he was to the truth, she couldn't wait any longer. Somewhere in the room, her phone vibrated softly. She looked at the screen. "Ready? Tomorrow at 8. Don't be late." The sender was marked only with the initials NP. A tear rolled down her face. She knew her life with James was over, but not for the reasons he thought. It wasn't just betrayal. There was something more, something he couldn't understand or forgive. James watched her through a crack in the door. He had returned home earlier than usual and now saw her bustling about, packing her things. His heart clenched with pain and anger. She's leaving. The thought hammered in his head, making his blood boil. He decided not to stop her. Not yet. He wanted to know where she was going, who was helping her, and what exactly she was hiding. The next morning, Sylvia left the house earlier than usual. Her appearance was flawless as always, but James noticed the nervousness in her movements. He watched her closely, sitting in his car parked a few blocks away. She got into a taxi. James started his engine and followed her slowly. He called Mark. She's on the move. I'm following her, but I want you to stay informed, James said, keeping his eyes on the taxi ahead. I'm nearby. If something goes wrong, let me know, the detective replied. The taxi stopped at a small private airfield on the outskirts of town. James parked his car at a distance and called Mark. She's flying out. Can you find out where? He asked. I have my sources. Give me a few minutes, Mark replied. James waited, hiding in the shadows. Sylvia disappeared behind the glass doors of the airfield building. A few minutes later, she reappeared, this time with Nick. He was holding her hand, and she wasn't pulling away. The sight was the final straw for James. Tickets for a private flight to Miami. They leave in 30 minutes, Mark informed him. Meet me there. We won't let them get away, James said. He stormed into the airfield building just as Sylvia and Nick were approaching security. Her face froze when she saw him. James, what are you doing here? She asked, trying to remain calm. Are you seriously asking me that? His voice was cold. I'm here to find out the truth. All of it. Nick stepped forward, but James stopped him with a glare. If you want to be next on the list of people I unleash my fury on, go ahead, he said. James, you don't understand. Sylvia began, but he interrupted her. No, Sylvia, it's you who doesn't understand. You thought you could run away, leaving me in the dark? You thought your lies would never come to light? Her eyes filled with tears, but she held her composure. I'm not doing this for myself, she said quietly. Then for who? His voice cracked. For him? No, for you. Those words caught him off guard. Her explanation was convoluted, but he grasped one thing. She was afraid. Afraid of something hidden behind Nick's false smiles. What does he have on you? James asked, looking directly into her eyes. You wouldn't understand, she whispered. Try me, he replied, stepping closer. Nick suddenly snapped. Leave her alone. She's doing this to protect you. Protect me? James laughed bitterly. From what? From something you can't even imagine, Nick said. Before James could get answers, Sylvia began to cry. You can't understand this now. Just trust me, she pleaded. Trust you? After everything? His voice was filled with pain. He tried to step back, but he felt chained by her lies. James stood by the glass doors of the airfield, watching as Sylvia and Nick disappeared through the airplane doors. He made no attempt to stop her. His fingers gripped the phone in his pocket so tightly that he nearly broke it. Her final words echoed in his mind. It's for your own good. He couldn't comprehend how the woman who had been his partner, his love for years, had become a stranger. Something was wrong, and that something gnawed at his peace. This isn't over, Sylvia, he whispered, walking back to his car. Back home, James pulled out a box containing their old photos and documents. He spread everything out on the kitchen table. Shared pictures, her financial statements, old letters. He was looking for something. Any clue that could explain what had happened and what she was hiding. His gaze landed on one document, a notarized power of attorney signed by Sylvia years ago. It listed an address he didn't recognize. What is this place? He muttered and took a picture of the document with his phone. He called Mark. I need you to check out an address for me, James said, reading off the details. Give me a few hours, Mark replied. In the meantime, James decided to investigate Sylvia's accounts. He found her old laptop, one she rarely used. The password was the same as always, Love James 2020. His heart tightened with pain. Opening her transaction history, he noticed several transfers to an unknown account. The amounts were substantial, and the payments were made regularly. What is this, Sylvia? He asked himself, taking screenshots. Later that evening, Mark called back. I looked into the address. It's an old house in a small suburb. The registered owner is someone named Richard Parks. Nothing unusual, but here's the catch. This man used to work for the company you founded. James froze. Richard Parks? I remember him. He was an accountant, but I fired him years ago for embezzlement. This could be the key to something bigger, Mark said. Want me to look into him? No, James replied after a pause. I'll do it myself. The next day, James drove to the address. The house was old, with peeling paint on the walls and an overgrown yard. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He decided to walk around the house, looking for any signs of life. Through a window, he saw boxes full of papers. The place looked as though someone had been packing in a hurry but hadn't finished. James tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, chaos reigned. Papers were scattered across the room. On a table, he found a pile of photographs. His heart stopped when he realized some of them featured Sylvia and Richard Parks. They stood together, smiling, with the backdrop of expensive restaurants and hotels. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, examining one photo where they were embracing. On another table, he found documents that revealed even greater fraud than the ones for which he had fired Richard. Sylvia's name was listed as one of the accomplices. James returned home with the sinking realization that his life would never be the same. He opened a bottle of whiskey, trying to make sense of it all. The Sylvia he thought he knew and the Sylvia from these documents were two different people. What had driven her to this? His phone vibrated. It was Mark. "There's one more thing you need to know. Richard Parks disappeared 3 months ago. The police suspect he either fled or was killed." "And how is this connected to Sylvia?" James asked. "She was the last person to see him alive," Mark replied. James sat in the dark room, staring at the photographs and documents. Everything he thought he knew felt like a lie. He understood one thing. Sylvia wasn't just hiding from him, but from someone far more dangerous. James sat in the dimly lit room, holding a glass of whiskey. His gaze swept over the photographs spread across the table. Every thread led back to Sylvia. She was the key to this mystery, but each new step only complicated things further. The silence of the house was deafening until the doorbell shattered the stillness. At first, he thought it was Mark, but as he approached the door, he felt something was off. When he opened it, his heart stopped. Sylvia stood on the doorstep, flanked by 2 men in black suits. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with fear. One of the men held her by the elbow as though she were a doll. "Hello, James," one of the strangers said. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable threat in his tone. "We need to talk." James froze, then stepped back, allowing them to enter. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking directly at Sylvia. She began, but the man interrupted her. "Your wife has been a bit disobedient," he said with a smile. "But we're not here to blame her. We're here to discuss your cooperation." Everyone sat at the table. One of the men placed a folder on the surface, opened it, and spread out several photographs. They showed James, his company, and financial documents he didn't recognize. "What is this?" James asked. "This is just a fraction of what we know about you," the stranger replied. "Did you think everything in your company was clean? That was a mistake." James felt the ground slipping out from under him. "That's not true. I've done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "Of course," the other man replied. "But someone worked very hard to make it look otherwise. And this is where your wife became part of our game." "James, I was trying to protect you," Sylvia said, her voice weak. "Protect me?" He turned sharply toward her. "You were working with them behind my back." "She had no choice," the man interjected. "We found a way to convince her." James looked at Sylvia, who lowered her head. "What do you want?" he asked, turning back to the men. "We want silence," one of them replied. "You will not make noise, involve the police, or try to investigate what we're doing. In return, your wife stays safe." James tried to stay calm. "You want me to just stay quiet and let you destroy everything I've built?" "Yes," the man answered without hesitation. "Otherwise." He pulled a gun from his pocket and placed it on the table. "The choice is yours." James felt his anger boiling inside. "If you think I'll let you manipulate me—" "This isn't manipulation," the man interrupted. "It's business." After several minutes of tense silence, James nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "I'll stay quiet." The men smiled and stood up. "You've made the right decision," one of them said. Sylvia seemed as though she wanted to say something, but the man tightened his grip on her arm and led her out of the house with him. James stood by the door, watching them walk to a black car. Sylvia glanced back at him for a moment, but said nothing. Once they were gone, James called Mark. "I need all the information about those people. They were just in my house, And now I know this isn't just business. This is war. Rain poured heavily against the windows of Mark Davis's office. James sat across from him, his face frozen in tense anticipation. Mark sifted through the documents spread out on the table in front of him. Among them were photographs, notes, and clippings from the case on Richard Parks's disappearance. "Find anything?" James asked, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "I found more than I expected," Mark said without looking up. "Parks didn't just disappear. His death is part of a larger game. And your wife seems to be deeper in this than you think." Those words hit James like a cold shower. He had thought this was only about financial fraud, but now it seemed far more serious. "Start from the beginning," he said. Mark pulled out a photograph from the crime scene. "Richard Parks disappeared 3 months ago, but a week before that, he was seen with your wife. And not just her. He was in the company of the 2 men you described to me yesterday, the ones who came to your house." "Those same men?" James tried to stay calm, but his voice wavered. "The same," Mark confirmed. "But here's something more interesting." He pulled out another document, an excerpt from financial records. "Parks received large sums of money into his account. These funds came through a company tied to your business. But all the transfers were issued under the name of—" "Sylvia," James interrupted him. "Exactly," Mark confirmed. James felt his heart tighten. "Are you saying she wasn't just a victim?" "She may have started as a victim, but now it looks like she's a full-fledged participant," Mark said, choosing his words carefully. "That doesn't sound like her," James shook his head. "Are you sure you really know her?" Mark asked. That evening, James returned home and immediately turned on his computer. He began reviewing accounts, documents, and photographs again. He was looking for anything that could confirm or refute Mark's words. Suddenly, he noticed something he had previously missed. One of the transfers was directed to an account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. The sender was listed as Richard Parks himself, but the recipient was a company called Lumia Industries. James had never heard of this company. He called Mark. "Do you know anything about Lumia Industries?" "What have you found now?" Mark asked. "It's a company that received money from Parks. It might be a key. Give me a few hours." "I'll look into it," Mark said and ended the call. The next morning, Mark called back. "James, this company is a shell. It's used for money laundering. But you know what's interesting? One of the directors is your wife." "What?" James leapt from his seat. "Not directly, but her name appears in the documents I found. It seems she was involved in this operation more than you thought." James felt his anger boiling. "I need to get to the truth." He decided to track down someone from Lumia Industries. His search led him to a man who was one of the company's co-founders, Lewis Carter, a former lawyer who had gone underground several years ago. James found him in an exclusive club. Lewis was sitting calmly at the bar, smoking a cigar. "We need to talk," James said, sitting down next to him. "About what?" Lewis didn't even flinch. "About Lumia Industries and my wife," James said. Lewis smiled. "Your wife? She was one of the smartest players in this game." "Game?" James asked, clenching his fists. "We're all players here, but some play better than others." "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Lewis leaned in closer. "You don't even know half the truth yet." James sat in his study, examining the documents Mark had brought. Among them were reports and signed contracts. At first glance, everything appeared completely legitimate, but now he knew. These papers concealed something dark, something that seemed utterly incredible. The company he had built over years had been used as a front for money laundering, and Sylvia's name appeared in these schemes far too often. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself. His phone rang, and James picked it up. It was Mark. "You need to come over. I've found something you'll want to see," the detective said. "What now?" James felt the tension rising with every word. "We've uncovered more about Lumia Industries. They didn't just use your company. They made you an accomplice. And James, this could destroy you." An hour later, James sat in Mark's office, staring at the new documents. On the detective's computer screen was a table showing money transfers. His name appeared on several transactions as a signatory. "Is this forged?" James asked. "Maybe, but proving that will be difficult," Mark said, pressing his lips together. They've done everything to make it look like you were fully aware of all their schemes. James ran a hand over his face. It felt like a nightmare. What are these funds? He asked. Money laundering, illegal investments, even connections to arms trafficking. They weren't just playing on your field. They built their entire operation on the foundation of your company. And how did I miss this? James felt his anger mixing with despair. You trusted people you shouldn't have, Mark replied. Maybe even your wife. That night, James sat alone in his study again. He recalled every moment when Sylvia had come to him with advice on how to run the business better. She always seemed so confident, convincing him to sign off on various deals. And now he realized those deals might have been key to the scheme. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was a number he didn't recognize. Who is this? James asked. That's not important, the voice replied. It was cold and calm. You need to stop digging, James. It's dangerous. Who are you? He repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. You have something we need. But if you keep interfering, you'll lose more than your company. The call ended abruptly. The next day, James met with Mark at a cafe. He told him about the call. They already know you're investigating, Mark said. That means we're close to something big. Is there any way to stop them? James asked. Maybe, but it's risky. We need testimony from someone on the inside. Sylvia, James said. His voice sounded as though he didn't even believe the words himself. If you can get her to talk, it could change everything, Mark agreed. James found Sylvia the next day in a rented apartment that Mark had helped him track down. She looked exhausted, her eyes filled with fear, but when she saw him, a flicker of pain appeared in them. What do you want, James? She asked, clenching her fingers. I want the truth, he said, and this time, you're going to give it to me. You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, she replied. No, Sylvia, you don't understand. They made me an accomplice. My name is now tied to their crimes. You dragged me into this. I didn't have a choice, she shouted, her voice breaking. They forced me. They knew everything about us, our business, our secrets, and if I didn't agree, they would have destroyed us. And you think that excuses it? His voice was loud and sharp. You should have come to me. We could have found a way out together. You would never have understood, James, she whispered. They have all of us in their grip. Her confession left more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. He could no longer trust her. And at the same time, he knew she was his only chance to uncover the truth. James sat in a dimly lit bar, staring into an empty glass. Mark sat across from him, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. On the table between them was a folder filled with photos, printed images of the men connected to Lumia Industries. One of those faces was now their target. We won't be able to cut through this entire web unless we break one of its threads, Mark said, leaning closer. And this guy, he's the weakest link. Lewis Carter, James said, reading the name as he looked at the photograph. Former lawyer, now a shadowy con artist. He's surrounded by layers of protection, but tonight we have a chance. I've got word he'll be at a private party, Mark said. If we play this quietly, we might be able to get the truth out of him. James nodded, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a risk. It was war. That night, they sat in a car parked near the mansion where the party was being held. The massive windows of the house were glowing with light, and elite guests strolled through the garden with champagne glasses in hand. James and Mark exchanged a look. Got a plan? James asked. We grab him quietly. If anything goes wrong, we disappear. Mark handed him a small stun gun. And this is our last resort. Inside the house, James spotted Lewis almost immediately. He was standing near the bar, animatedly chatting with a group of women. His smug smile sent a wave of anger through James, but he held it in. Mark gave a signal. While James distracted the bartender, Mark disabled the security system in a nearby room. They moved quickly, like surgeons. Done, Mark whispered through the earpiece. Your move, James replied, approaching Lewis. Lewis Carter, James said, holding a glass of wine. You know me? Lewis asked, looking at him with interest. More than you think, James replied, barely holding back his anger. And we need to talk. Lewis frowned but didn't have time to respond. Mark appeared behind him and quickly pressed the stun gun to his neck. Lewis slumped unconscious. "Let's get him out of here," Mark said, helping James lift the body. They brought Lewis to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. When he regained consciousness, he was tied to a chair. A single light bulb swung overhead, casting shadows on the walls. "What the hell is this?" Lewis shouted, struggling against the ropes. "This is what you deserve," James said, leaning closer. "You're going to tell me everything about Lumia Industries. And about my wife." "I don't know anything about your wife," Lewis yelled. "Lie," James said. "I know you worked with her. I know you made her drag me into this scheme." "She came to us willingly," Lewis replied, smiling. "You think she was a victim? She was a key player, James." "You're lying," James shouted, raising the stun gun. "You think this will make me talk?" Lewis said. "We have rules. If I talk, I'm dead. And if you don't talk, you're dead here and now," Mark said, pulling a knife from his pocket. Lewis trembled, his smugness vanishing. Lewis began to speak, and every word felt like a dagger driving into James's heart. "Lumia Industries used your company as a front for laundering money. But the worst part—" Lewis paused, his smirk fading into something darker. "Sylvia willingly became part of this scheme." James froze. The words felt wrong, foreign, as though they belonged to someone else's life. "She's smart, but she's greedy," Lewis continued, his voice carrying an edge of disdain. "She couldn't resist the allure of big money. She knew exactly what she was getting into." "That's a lie," James whispered, his throat tight. He felt as though the walls were closing in around him, his world collapsing piece by piece. Lewis's smirk returned. "The truth is, James, you never really knew your wife. She's not who you think she is. She's a brilliant manipulator, and you were her perfect cover." Mark, standing silently in the corner, finally interjected. "And why should we believe anything you're saying? For all we know, you're just trying to save your own skin." "Because if I lie, I'm dead," Lewis snapped. "You think I'd risk that just to mess with James?" Sylvia wasn't forced into this. She saw the opportunity and took it. Hell, she thrived in it. James looked away, memories of Sylvia flashing through his mind. The late nights when she said she was working. The sudden, unexplained trips. The deal she'd insisted he sign. The way she'd smile at him, full of confidence, as if nothing in the world could shake her. "Where is she now?" James asked, his voice hollow. Lewis hesitated, then sighed. "She's in London. Lumia has a safe house there. If you want answers, that's where you'll find her." James didn't wait for Mark's input. "I'm going to London," he said. "James, think this through," Mark warned. "I have thought it through," James replied, his voice steely. "I need the truth." James boarded the plane with a single suitcase. He barely noticed the hum of the engines or the chatter of passengers around him. His thoughts were consumed by Sylvia. The woman he'd loved, the woman he thought he knew, now felt like a stranger. What would he find in London? Would she deny everything? Would she confess? Or worse, would she confirm Lewis's accusations with the same confident smile that once reassured him? Landing in London felt surreal. The city, bustling and vibrant, seemed to mock the turmoil inside him. He took a cab to the address Lewis had provided, a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. James stood outside the door, his heart pounding. For a moment, he hesitated. What if Lewis was lying? What if Sylvia wasn't here? Or what if she was, and everything he feared was true? Steeling himself, he knocked. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Sylvia. She looked different, tired, worn, as though the weight of her secrets had finally caught up to her. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You lied to me," he said, stepping inside. His voice trembled with anger and hurt. Sylvia closed the door, her hands shaking. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." James interrupted, his voice rising. "You used me. You used the company I built, the trust one gave you. And for what? Money? Power?" Tears filled her eyes, but he didn't let them sway him. "Why, Sylvia? Why did you do it?" She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I didn't want this, James. I didn't plan for it to happen this way. But they knew everything about us, about the company. They threatened to destroy everything if I didn't cooperate. You could have come to me, he said, his voice softer now. We could have fought them together. I was trying to protect you, she said through her tears. They would have destroyed you, James. And I couldn't let that happen. James stared at her, his emotions a storm of anger, betrayal, and a flicker of something he couldn't name. Hope? You have to testify, he said finally. Against Lumia. Against all of them. Sylvia looked up at him, her face pale. If I do that, they'll kill me. They'll kill us both if we don't fight back, James said. The next few weeks were a blur. Sylvia agreed to testify, and with Mark's help, they began gathering evidence. Every piece of paper, every name, every transaction became a weapon in their battle against Lumia Industries. But Lumia didn't take the betrayal lightly. Threatening phone calls, shadowy figures following them, and attempts to hack into their files became daily occurrences. One night, Sylvia sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she signed her statement. Are you sure about this? James asked, standing across from her. She nodded. I have to do this. For you. For us. James didn't reply. He wanted to believe her, but the scars of her betrayal ran deep. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Sylvia's testimony was damning, implicating key players in Lumia Industries. But it also exposed her own role, painting her as both a victim and an accomplice. James sat in the gallery, watching her speak. She looked fragile yet resolute, as though she was finally unburdening herself from years of secrets. When the verdict came, Lumia's leaders were sentenced to decades in prison. Sylvia, given her cooperation, received a reduced sentence. She would serve 3 years, but would be placed under protective custody after her release. James stood outside the courthouse, watching as Sylvia was led away in handcuffs. She glanced back at him, her eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, she mouthed. James nodded but said nothing. Months passed, and James sold his company, unable to bear the memories it carried. He started over, moving to a quiet coastal town where no one knew his name. One evening, as he sat on the beach watching the waves, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find peace. S. James stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Do you think Sylvia's actions were justifiable given the circumstances, or were they unforgivable?